Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Why Abdul Alhazred Went Mad by D.R. Smith. Originally published in the Necromanticon 1950. The fabulous Necronomicon was never finished. This is well known to all advanced students of the occult, whether or not they have had the courage and good fortune to peruse a copy. Well known, in spite of the fact that few who have delved into the soul-blasting secrets of that loathsome mixture of revolting instruction and blasphemous history have managed to preserve their sanity to read that final chapter, which begins with the mutterings of one in a frenzy and dies away in the hideous ravings of mania. Abdul Alhazred, may his name be accursed forever, remained devilishly sane during the acquisition and recording of that abominable knowledge which few throughout the centuries have dared to acquire, even in part. It was the story he attempted to tell in that last frenzied chapter that shattered his black mind and sent his spirit gibbering with horror out of his diseased body into the gleeful embraces of the torturers of the damned. And no one has ever dared to make that story known. Indeed, the most diligent search has failed to trace any mention of the terrible message by any student of the occult. Yet it was known to one sublime genius, and the crux of it published to the world in words still spoken on the public stage. Anthony, on the Alps, it is reported, thou didst eat strange flesh, which some did die to look on. But should that story be widely known, it may be that what drove the blaspheming Arab mad may well drive honest men sane. And so I transcribe below, shorn of as much of its incoherent madness as possible, and cleansed of the filth that besmirched every thought that bubbled from the cesspit of Alhazred's obscene mind. A correct version of the last chapter of the Necronomicon. There was one other, the Great One, Great Father and Great Mother in one, greater than great Cthulhu, than Hastur his brother, than Shub-Niggurath, the goat with 1,000 young, than Sathogwa, than great Yog-Sothoth himself, for they are but one spawn. One was once of the great old ones, near the mightiest, for one challenged the supremacy of Azathoth himself, the blind idiot, lord of all. Nay, his children have told me, but this I may not believe, that one, who is too great to be named, was indeed lord of all. So great was one that they who are not to be thought of, fearing lest evil become supreme, hurled him from his awful throne and chained him with chains of flesh that he might not break to this, the planet of the damned. And as he fell, he spawned Yog-Sothoth, who only is less than Azathoth, so says great Cthulhu, first of the great abominations which one formed from his own flesh to be his servants and the masters of the planet. Mighty was the Great One, loathsome the body they had bound him in, yet he gloried in its horror and moulded it with his own will into a thing to describe, which would strike death into the craven soul of mortal men. The faceless Nyarlathotep, messenger of the great old ones, could not endure the foulness that was one, where he lay in a pool of his own slimy exhalations in the cavern in the mountains, lay and ruled the world with the terror of himself and the gods he had spawned. Had but I, Abdul Alhazred, been alive then to worship him, great his children, diligently have I served them, and well have they paid me, with ecstasies the name of which would draw shrieks of horror from those white-livered children in men's shapes who talk so loud of their puerile torturings with knives and fire and water. But the Great One, to serve him would have been, curse the Roman. May the hounds of Tyndalos hunt his shrieking soul through the ends of space for 1,000,000,000 times 1,000,000 eons. How could he do that which he did? Great Cthulhu I asked, and he shrank and would not reply. Sathogwa I asked, and Sathogwa would not tell me. Yog-Sothoth I asked, greatest of the spawn, and Yog-Sothoth would not tell me. Yea, by my art did I call on Nyarlathotep, the faceless howler in the darkness, commanding the messenger of the great old ones as never man had dared before, and Nyarlathotep ceased his eternal howling and would not reply, though he feared me as he fears only Cthulhu, the eternal fiery one, who when the time comes shall consume him utterly. Was it a machination of Azathoth? One's children say Azathoth, even mighty as he was, would never have dared to plot against the Great One. Yet surely it was only by some hostile guidance that this man, this incredible man, was driven with his rabble of soldiers into the mountains where lay the cavern of the Great One. Perhaps the elder gods, but they had only wanted to exile the Great One, not destroy him. However it was, the Roman came, Marcus Antonius, a big, brawling, lecherous brute who boasted he feared God nor devil. A foolish boast, which many have made to me, and fled shrieking if they but smelt the weak old effluvium left from one of Cthulhu's visits. But Marcus Antonius, how could there be such a man? Man he was, who fought and loved like a man, and died foolishly as a man will through stupid devotion to a trollop. Could such a one be greater than the great ones to whom I have given so much worship, that I have damned myself to all eternity for no! I must tell it, it must be recorded. This Antonius and his soldiers were lost, starving. They drank the urine of the horses, they killed the horses and ate them, and went on through the bare mountains. Antonius was their leader. He boasted of his strength and endurance, and would not eat of the horse flesh, leaving it for the others. On they went, and they came to a valley, a gloomy cleft in the hills, but water ran crystal clear down a rocky bed, and scrubby pines grew around. They drank the water and made a huge fire of the trees, but the hunger was still there, and Marcus Antonius was hungriest of all. At the head of the cleft was a cave. Caves are often inhabited by animals. Animals can be eaten. Marcus Antonius led the way to the mouth of the cave, but there all stopped, for from the cave came such a stench as would petrify a man's soul within his living body, and more evil than that. None could advance further, but Antonius, who called them cowards and went down into the dreadful gloom of that cavern, went alone. Silence, a long silence. Then suddenly, horribly, the reverberating uproar of a furious combat in some vast hollow below, part of the noise, the bellows of fighting mad Marcus Antonius, part of such a nature that many who heard fled, screaming from the accursed spot. They were the lucky ones. Those who remained, white-faced, frozen with terror, heard the noises continue and draw nearer. Abruptly the cavern belched forth a writhing mass, the maniacally fighting Antonius smeared from head to foot with a mixture of his own blood and revolting slime from that which he fought, that which he had dragged out into the light of day, where never had it been seen before, that which his javelin could not slay, his sword not wound, that abomination at the sight of which the watchers dropped dead, the very souls blasted out of their bodies. It called for help, and twilight shrouded the sun, and the strong shapes of the windwalkers, Ithaqua and Elegor and Jar, and great Hastur himself, came howling down. And Antonius saw and laughed unafraid, and called upon Jupiter, whom the Greeks called Zeus, the Lord of Heaven and Master of Storms, called asking for aid as from an equal. And lo, on the walkers and on Hastur, on Cthulhu hurtling from the sea, and on Yog-Sothoth gathering formlessly from everywhere and nowhere, on all the hastening spawn of one, Jupiter hurled his thunderbolts. And his laughter crashed and bellowed and split the skies as he lashed back the children of one with the multi-thonged lashes of the lightning. And under that madness of light and noise, Marcus Antonius, with strength beyond the compute of mortal man, raised the Great One and hurled him onto the mighty fire his men had kindled. Horribly, the one screamed and writhed amongst the glowing embers, and Antonius laughed and threw on more wood. And in the heart of the flames the one screamed abominably until little but blacked charcoal was left of his frightful body. And then Marcus Antonius, a man amongst men, who feared nor God nor devil, but who was very hungry, smashed the charred shell, and inside found nothing but a single steaming piece of rank flesh, loathsome of shape and colour and odour. But it was flesh, and he ate. Yes, he ate it. The brutish Roman dolt, he ate it, the yet living heart of the Great One, and so he destroyed for ever the Great One. And if one could himself be thus destroyed by brute courage and appetite, what of his children? Have I given my life, and more than my life, to the service of those who have no more power over a brave man than the beasts of the field? The rest is madness. End of Why Abdul Alhazred Went Mad by D.R. Smith. Anonymous. By George T. Wetzel. Tobacco farmers there still speak, with dread and dislike, of ancient covered bridges, certain Palladian windowed houses, and even of an occasional unsociable and reclusive family, but when asked the basis of their ill feeling, they can answer only that their forebears in this tidewater region also felt thusly. I was on an antiquarian quest through a tidal swamp of southern Maryland, searching for the weedy site of a particular, now long extinct, Potomac River town, a region rich with such inherited superstitious beliefs when the twilight sky filled with rain squalls. Swamp oaks are not always the best shelter, so I looked anxiously for other means of weathering the squall. I had heard the local gossipers at the rotting, abandoned steamboat landing speak with dislike and vague fear of a ruined 17th century Maryland manor house that stood in the general vicinity where I was exploring. So I began to climb up a tree to see if it was very near me. It was, and I ran to its questionable shelter. Rain dripped off me and puddled around me on the mouldy flooring of its dilapidated hall. The place reeked with damp and soon had me wishing I had instead remained in the leaf-fragrant shelter of the woods. Behind me, the appearance of the hall was impossible to discern due to the deep gloom cast by the rain, which was now descending in a blind cloud, driven almost into a mist or spray by the gales of wind. When one of the few lulls of a squall came, I ventured to peep out of the door and see what sort of manor house it was. Seeing as how such a view had not been possible when I raced up before, because the driving clouds of rain reduced vision to but a few yards. Now, however, I was able to note in surprise that the roof over me was an incredible twin to the former Bond Manor house of Calvert County. The ancient Bond Manor was also an early house, built in the 17th century, but it was pulled down a few years ago to make room for an ugly farm building. And here was a place bearing remarkably resemblant features to that house, which was unique and almost the only known example of a cross-house with a medieval overhang in the Old South, until I stumbled into this one. A sudden intensity in the downpour drove me back from the door and broke up my jubilation at this architectural find. By the uncertain light, I made my way into one of the cruciform's arms and into the great hall that had open beam ceilings and an enormous fireplace. Gothic moulding was carved on the mantelpiece, and a faded and indistinct mural painting decorated the overmantel. There were traces of Jacobean style here, as well as on the outside of the relic, I perceived, as the flickering light of a fire I started up illumined the room. A couple of pieces of rude furniture were revealed then, and I started with surprise. Why would anyone attempt to live in such a dampish ruin as this? From a glance, I noted that such occupancy must have been not long ago, as the furniture was not antique stuff but the rough items you would expect a countryman to own. But that it was now vacant seemed evidenced by the dust on everything. Near the fireplace on the floor, I picked up a notebook of damp, discolored pages, written in a rectilinear hand. It was a curious manuscript, full of the experimental results of engulfed drugs such as lobelia and mandrake, and references to Herrick's Materia Medica, Paracelsus's Herbarius, and that elusive book of Michael Zittel's On Die Heimlich Wissenschaft, while one page contained obscure remarks about a dark anodyne once used in the legendary drowned city of Ys, and on another leaf I found puzzling references to Egyptian balms and oils. Occasionally there were significant passages that would suggest the writer was a metaphysicist and alchemist. One such passage that intrigued me was his experiment's basic hypothesis of using a drug cauldron, the simultaneous imbibition of several drugs. This was extraordinary in a way, as I do not think modern science ever attempted this kind of experiment. What this alchemist hoped to accomplish was not definitely stated, but he did seem enthralled by the idea that, since each drug had its only individual effect on the senses, a drug cauldron of different combinations would give him all the separate effects of the separate drugs in his cauldron, but acting upon his senses simultaneously. Nevertheless, this fantastic, almost science-fictional idea of his has a strange fascination about it. I had heard of the bizarre effect on the time sense that hashish has, of another drug that telescopes time, the drug fantasies that De Quincey experienced and recorded, and drug dreams similarly described by Baudelaire. How lobelia causes phantasms to evolve because of its effect on the optic nerve, and another drug that imposed on the aural centers musical aberrations that could equal the haunted mysticism of a César Franck, of laudanum which gave Poe nightmares and which he told of. Even H.P. Lovecraft had once essayed anent the eerie result of a certain drug which brought the user to the rim of the outside, beyond which no light exists. If this alchemist could encompass this staggering multitude of sensual and spiritual effects all at once upon himself, I wondered if his or any other mind could stand the shock without disorientation of self and a resultant madness. The experiment would prove dangerous. I was not surprised when I read a couple of pages later of his dawning belief in the dream soul superstition that is current in all primitive mythologies. To me, this was a symptom of decaying reason when so brilliant an experimenter, and I must confess there were flashes of near genius, degenerated into consideration of superstition. Whoever this man was, his researches verged on the astounding, from a repetition of text phrases, couched in a sort of cipher, and in conjunction with certain chemical formulas for his drug cauldron. I began to perceive that he had solved one of the most puzzling mysteries in organic chemistry. The ethyl radical, that is frequent in drugs with a hypnotic effect, has long caused speculations among some chemists. My anonymous experimenter went further than mere speculation. He apparently solved this molecular arrangement and knew something of its valence characteristics not guessed by chemists, for I found scattered throughout his notes peculiar but workable structural formulas, and as my admiration for the man would mount, I then would encounter textual notes on superstitious beliefs, like his extrapolations on the dream soul ideas of the primitives and their insistence that the dream soul wandered from the body in dream and drugged slumber. The manuscript dragged on almost pedantically with preposterous accounts of what the drug camphor allegedly did when added to that monstrous drug cauldron, its causing of sensual aberrations that continue over into the waking state are too well known to remark upon. Then there was the fear of the writer of being mistaken for dead when deep in drugged slumber. A basis for this fear did exist, as I recalled that respiratory depressants like certain barbiturate compounds have a physiological effect that closely resembles a death state, and this man was using a number of them simultaneously. No wonder he feared lest someone find him during the drugged state of one of his experiments and commit him to premature burial. The outlandish experiences he had while in the drugged state were horrendous fantasies worthy of a Lovecraft, with their adumbrations of entities encountered in nightmarish settings, of surrealistic perceptions of utterly unbelievable transgressions of natural law, perspective effects inverted, distortions in the time sense. My mind reeled from just contemplating his accounts, and he had lived through them. The exotic drugged visions of De Quincey were inane babblings beside this journey into the kaleidoscope of cosmic evil and outsidedness. The calligraphy upon the remaining pages was different, as if made by the same original hand, now hindered by some physical anomaly that caused it to careen and fumble the lettering. It was the last entry. April 29. Just returned to consciousness. Must decrease the lobelia in formula, as it has an increasing tendency to keep me under too long. The camphor in formula seems about right, as I still retain distinct memory of just past vision. Will record it here, while the camphor effect enables vision to still remain in brain. Took usual precautions, leaving this notebook in a prominent place, antidote by couch, etc., then drank the present mixture. Usual preliminary symptoms manifested themselves. Then the ensuing anomalous state of exotic and ephemeral sense phantasms. Once across this abyss, the disordered neural messages stabilized and perception was again possible. I hovered above a valley in which cacti abounded. A colossal stone city sprawled there, through which a chain of great lakes ran. Across the lakes stretched causeways akin to those of Tenochtitlan of the Aztecs. The feathered serpent motif appeared in fresco on temples, before which the serpent column of the Toltec culture supported the portal openings. Tlaxtli courts and plazas were scattered in the tangle of buildings, truncated pyramids. I saw one structure that was the twin of the temple of Quetzalcoatl at Teotihuacan. Its facade of embryonic panels and serpent sculpture was more than the twin, it was the Teotihuacan temple. The colossal city was a pristine Teotihuacan, the religious center of the mysterious Toltecs, not the debris and rubble-clustered group of ruins known to 20th century eyes. I was gazing on a site that existed countless centuries ago. A magnetism pulled at me, and I struggled against it when I saw where it was dragging me. The central pyramid to which all the city's causeways and streets and buildings were oriented. An atmosphere of evil hung about this axial pyramid, yet I marveled at the same time at the aspect of dark grandeur it had. My feeble struggles against the force were useless, for now I saw the top of it leap up, and then my impalpable body sank through the stone into a mindless limbo. A greying of the utter black soon took place, and I was in a small room. I had no doubt it was the chambered interior of the pyramid. Only once before has anything like it been known to me, the vault found in the temple of the high priest in the ruins at Chichen Itza. The walls of this chamber had not a single blank spot on them, being carved with the feathered serpent motif, but in a rectilinear style exactly like the temple facade of Xochicalco. In between the undulating coils of the carved serpents were glyphs and the stepped scroll ornament called Xicocoleuqui. The ceiling was held up by serpent columns. The entrance was a blackened moor which must have been one of the giant edifice's subterranean drainage tubes discovered by Dr. Gamio in our time. Seated within a glyph design on the floor, beside a flaming brazier in which both fire and copal incense burned, was a man who seemed to have come to life out of the Troano Codex. He traced the glyphs of Can, Muluk, Ainc, and Coac at the four corners of his protective talisman, then began to address me. By necromancy, he had summoned me out of the future to answer his questions as the Olin Tonatiah. "Why do you desire this knowledge?" I asked him. Puzzlement spread over his face, and ignoring my question, he intoned a guttural phrase, made a sign in the air, and demanded I tell him what he wanted to know. A force indescribable beat around me, but curiously had no effect upon my resistance. In some inexplicable manner, my psyche was not completely under his control. He was vastly surprised, he said, as the things he called up had always been subservient to him. Was I, he asked, some entity from the world's twilight who had such extraordinary powers though defunct? A sorcerer in Mu once encountered such. He had heard. I shook my head. Still puzzled, he consented to explain why he wanted such knowledge. By necromancy, he conjured up those from ages anterior to his and from the dim future, in a quest to delve into the secrets, the history, and the world disasters of succeeding sun eras, and this wealth of esoteric and arcane knowledge was set down in codices and in part of the calendrical stones. So, seekers after knowledge in bilateral eons could consult it for a certain price. A dead mind from Paleogean mists told the Toltec priest of the end brought about by animal, the ocelotl era, which seemed to have been the age of dinosaurs. He conversed with an outlandish being that had lived in airless interstellar space concerning the Ehecatl era, when a tremendous wind, funneling down from the stars, devastated the globe and engulfed in its vortex this space beast, hurling it to its death in the troposphere of Earth. And there was the entity who whispered of the Quiahuitlera, when a strange rain of fire covered the planet. A drowned Ramoal, conjured up, related of the ATL era, the last one, when a worldwide flood came and submerged the ancient continent of Mu in the Pacific. Many more shadows of coming events and past history were thus found by this Toltec. In all ancient chronicles of the Incas, the Mayas, and the Mexicans, the coming of the Spaniards was well known, and they are but copies of this Toltec's prophecy, for he summoned a dead conquistador who confessed the infamy of Cortes and Pizarro. What this Toltec desired of me was to know if the Olin era, the time an earthquake is to destroy the world, had begun in my age. As I replied negatively, a chilling apprehension filled me as I recalled ominous speculations of scientists concerning what nuclear bombs might do to the Earth's axial stability. The scheduled underwater, a bomb test at Bikini was never carried out because of such fears. A ghost of a Ruvodium from the future had witnessed part of the Olin Tonatiah, which was prefaced by a giant air battle over the frozen ocean and part of his city, lost in the polar wastes. For ages, his people had lived inviolate in their icy fortress and were a mixture of Norse and indigenous Eskimo blood, the Norse being the remnants of 12th century Greenland colonists who fled a weird doom and sought sanctuary in the Arctic. But the war in the skies ended the Ruvodium idyll. Fearful detonations, unquestionably hydrogen and cobalt bombs, tore up the ice cap and melted it into great seas. In the polar heavens, strange auras glowed. But this was not the worst. Ground forces of both sides began a contest over polar terrain and set off an increasing number of nuclear weapons against each other's armies. The result was inescapable. The Earth's axial rotation, disturbed in its most vulnerable spot, wobbled, and planet-wide seismic shocks began. I screamed at the Toltec to stop, to reveal no more. What partial power he held over me seemed to vanish when my despair caused me to cry out. The whole chamber twisted and spiraled, blurred, and was gone in a twinkling, and I returned to a mindless oblivion. Eventually I crept up through a greying void and awoke. The usual nausea, debility of the limbs, and deadened senses were at once experienced. This Teotihuacan adventure frightens me in many ways, and there is a new physical sensation I now feel that I have never before had as an after-effect. Must cut down the cauldron's strength, but I have a terrible presentiment it may be due to another reason. The crazy, overlarge script began to falter near its termination, and at the end of the last sentence it expired into an ominous illegibility, with a smudge or claw-like mark at the bottom that exuded a faint and unpleasant fetidness. When I reached this part of the book, there was no more writing in it, and smelled the faint fetid reek on its page. I became aware that similar fetidness was in the room and had been there when I first entered the building. But the mouldy timbers had fooled me into thinking it part of their odour of decay. The fetid smell grew stronger near the doorway into the blackened hallway, and I tracked it to a stronger place near the door into the opposite wing. Against murky lighted windows of that room was silhouetted chemical apparatus, and along the walls the dull glint of glassware. A scuffling movement came from a darkened corner, and I watched it, thinking a rodent would emerge. But at my height, I saw a pair of watery eyes shine, and the fetid reek grew overwhelming. The inhabitant of the gloom stumbled forward in the lesser dark. It was a horrible travesty of the human form, yet I knew at once what had happened. The notebook gave me the clue, and felt a compassion for this presence. But as it shambled closer, revulsion overpowered me, and I backed out and shrank along the hall passageway, still too shocked to run. But it still groped closer, and I stepped out into the driving rain. Whatever motive impelled the thing I do not know, but it had no knowledge of what the rain would do to its already precarious hold on life, if such animation can be called life. The driving rain pelted and tore at its substance, unmercifully revealing white bones and washing the blotches of rot from its form. I could not watch the terrible sight any longer, but turned and hid my face. Who knows what crumbling fleshy abode may await the dream soul of a living sleeper when that soul has tarried elsewhere, too long and too far. End of Anonymous by George T. Wetzel. Caer Sidhi by George T. Wetzel. Dark Mind, Dark Heart, 1954. Documents in the case of the Shoal Light. 1. O'Malley's Journal. November 6, 1799. Awoke this morning from another nightmare. Neil also had such disturbed slumber. He has unusual views regarding them, describes them as accompanied by a whirling around without motion, which seems to me pure Celtic superstition. But the real cause of the dreams is probably not his imagination. He seems to think some baneful influence is at work, but rather the difficulty we have been having with the villagers. It is this concern that gives us both bad dreams. He disagrees. This forenoon several of the village fishermen rowed out to our lighthouse to remonstrate with us. The shoal light took God's grace away from them, they claimed. What blasphemy! To think that shipwrecks and the drowning of poor sailors are a special mark of God's favour to gain them the spoils of salvage. They are as bad as the Cornishmen who have lured ships to their doom with false lights. November 7th, 1799. Brian Mackenzie rode out unobtrusively this morning with a letter left for us at the Turk's Head Tavern by the post rider. It had been sent by the Trinity House of Navigation to tell us an inspector is on his way, no doubt to check our logbook, for this light has been reported unfavourably by several ship captains, who claim its beacon operated oddly when sighted. Neil and I have been very attentive to our watches. It seems very strange that such reports should have been made, and neither of us can understand it. Mackenzie warned us of trouble, perhaps this evening. The fishermen are speaking against the light and met last night at the Turk's Head, where they roused themselves to fury against the light. We primed and loaded our fowling piece and our 3 pistols. Neither of us is alarmed, but we cannot help being uneasy, and being sleep-weary does not help. Sleep last night was full of illogical nightmares, of confused ideas, alien visions, a dreadful sense of vertigo. I did not rest much, and I have been tired all day. yet I will need sharp ears and eyes which are already heavy with fatigue. Neil is in the same condition. Having had worse dreams than I, his recurrent dream came back, the anomalous nightmare of a whirling around without motion, which, he thinks, must have some connection, however obscure, with our light. Evening, the attack came just after dusk. Neil has an ugly head wound as a result of it. 2 boats attempted to land on the rocks, unseen, but Neil heard their oars creak and challenged them. One man stood up in his boat, shook his fist and cursed us. Then 2 others fired at Neil, one shot wounding him. I returned their fire before they could reload. They retreated, not without some wounded, I believe. November 8th, 1799. Awake all last night. No new attack. The strain of watching shoreward constantly is taking its toll. My head swims with dizziness. If only I could snatch a few hours' sleep, but I dare not. Neil needs a doctor's care, but it would be disastrous to leave the light unguarded, for the fisherman would surely demolish it. Neil is too irrational to be of any help, and certainly cannot resume his watch. In his delirium, Neil's nightmares and superstitions seem to be taking conscious form, at least to him. I found him at dawn with his ear pressed to the stone floor. He was listening to the sound of the sea, he said. He explained that both seashells and lighthouses were hollow spirals, and thus both subject to the same acoustical phenomena. He babbled somewhat incoherently about the architectural similarity of our lighthouse to the Caer Sidhi, the spiral castle of Celtic myth. The fishermen left us alone all day. Perhaps they are waiting for the dark of the moon to try again. November 9th, 1799. My 3rd night of sleeplessness. Every time I close my eyes, I seem to plunge into hallucination or nightmare. Sometimes I feel that I am asleep, despite my open eyes and general awareness of my surroundings. Neil's muttering about the Caer Sidhi stirred my memories of something I had forgotten long ago. An old farmer I once knew accidentally ploughed into a raised knoll in his grain field, one which had never been planted to grain, and opened a passageway. A local clergyman, an amateur antiquarian, crawled in, and found it an ancient chambered mound, whose walls were carved with the Celtic spiral of immortality. The relics were not Britanno-Roman, he said, and talked a great deal of symbols found before graves in Goidelic legends, of cromlechs, and of obscure philological mythic relations between the Welsh Sidhi and the Cid of Erin, and of Toynoyant and Caer Cwrw. There was something else about Caer Sidhi of some significance, but my mind is so fatigued that memory of it will not return to me. I sat on the parapet outside for a long while last night with a lantern. As the clockwork mechanism revolved it, I felt the rhythm of the light winking out in one quadrant and darkness that rushed in to fill the resulting vacuum. Perhaps this is where Neil gets his strange nightmare of a whirling around without motion, nothing more than the revolving beacon on top of our stationary lighthouse. And yet... November 10th, 1799. A smoke squall has now raged for hours, one of the kind the Norwegians call a rogueflage breeding in the ocean between Norway and the Orkneys. It is in a way a godsend, for the hostile fishermen will never put out from shore in such weather to attack the light. So I have been able to sleep and rest. We had the first hint of it at dawn. The clouds took on a water-green tint. Afterwards, I saw an unbroken black line far out to sea. This crept, hardly perceptibly, toward shore. In an hour it was near enough to study in detail with my glass. It was a black wall of water, fathoms high, the herald of a fearful storm to follow. I saw a ship, too. Did its captain not see our warning beacon in the grey dawn? If he came closer, the monstrous waves would pound him on our reef. The aqueous wall grew to awesome heights, reaching almost to the waning stars and thrusting its crown through the lower levels of the clouds there. It seemed to me that this monstrous wave would surely roll over and swallow up the earth in its maw, yet it was still leagues away, and growing larger, wearing the aspect of doom. I took Neil down into the tower and lashed him, and then myself to the beams, while the wall of water came rushing on like the sound of the Last Judgment. The roaring of water steadily increased, I thought for hours, but it must have been only minutes, until all existence was one tremendous crescendo of wind and water. It struck at last, and the tower shook as if beset by a cyclopean earthquake. Tons of water crashed into the tower through the lantern and through fissures between the stone blocks. drenching and almost drowning us. Lesser structures would have been torn up into the air and scattered, but our tower was built to withstand the enormous tidal surges and the incredibly high seas that rise from winds and storms blowing across the entire Atlantic without impediment, forces vastly more destructive than anything known to nature. Then it passed. I untied Neil and myself, and struggling through the water, some still pouring in, made my way to the top of the tower. A few dead fish and some seaweed littered the interior of the smashed lantern, debris spewed up by the ocean. But outside the world still existed. The force of the wave was still being thrown back by the shore's mass. Out on the sea a waterlogged hulk drifted, with several unfortunate seamen clinging to its masts. The rebounding swell shook the tower and passed on toward the foundering ship. I could not watch the end. November 11th, 1799. The storm is diminishing today, though the wind still drives sheets of water above the boiling sea. Visibility is very low. Evening, I repaired the lantern as best I could and got it into working order. I could not repair the shattered windows, and now the wind whistles eerily within the tower, like a single bass pipe in a church organ, or that sound a boy makes by blowing over the lip of an empty bottle. Several feet of water still stand below. Neil is much worse. He raves now and then, but is in a kind of torpor, almost comatose. I cannot understand most of what he says, but it is disquieting if not frightening to listen to him babble about the Caer Sidhi, coupling it with such other worldly places as Anwfn and Pedrivan, all the more so since the significance of Caer Sidhi occurs to me now. And I remember enough of my boyhood in Erin, of the Celtic lore, to know that the Caer Sidhi was much feared and believed in by the older fishermen, that its name in the Gaelic, meaning spiral castle, was well chosen, an ominous symbol of death, that it revolved or spiraled at night so that none coming to its base could find its entrance. And more I cannot or would rather not recall. In many ways, its watery isolation, the spiral stairs, the revolving light, this tower is akin to the Caer Sidhi. Lighthouse geometry and architecture might be precarious. November 12th, 1799. Someone on shore attempted signal communication today, but the wind is too violent and the atmosphere too full of sea spray, the rogflage, to permit reading the signals. Perhaps they saw Neil from the shore. Last night I put Neil on the parapet outside the tower. I would be more Christian, but I have a horror of him now. I cannot put him into the sea. In any event, they will think that I am mad. Perhaps I am. What I have noticed these past few nights inclines me to doubt my own reason, though I have tried to keep this record sane and balanced. That is the blurring of the view outside the tower, particularly at night, like a landscape glimpsed through a flawed window pane. No natural explanation offers itself for it, if it is an actual phenomenon and not the hallucination of decayed reason. Another thing, one utterly outre, threatens my sanity. Can the residuum of one man's nightmares be left over for another's dreams? I awoke trembling last night from visions like those Neil had, those that cursed his last nights and haunted his days. I seem to recall its beginning in a megalithic place where I wandered among cromlechs, dolmen stones and menhirs, like fantastically high walls making a maze of spiral design. I was in a roofless, gigantic tower, down which shone a million stars out of heavens virtually alive with those circumpolar stars ever to be seen. Heavens in which Draco writhed evilly about that forgotten axis of the skies, where once it reigned eons ago, coiling and twisting around Polaris. But what drew me in that alien place was the great nebula of Andromeda, that majestic whirlpool of light whose irresolvable depths held a fascination I could not escape. There was a curious association of ideas dominating all things, that vast nebula, the watery vortex of the maelstrom at the bottom of which the monster kraken is rumored to lurk, and the endless ascending stairs of a tower that reached up out of blackness and ascended to darkness above. And, as in my dream, I contemplated these triple spirals, I saw suddenly descending upon me, like a sentient beast, a towering waterspout. A mass of wind-driven water comes screaming out of the starlit darkness, blotting out the stars. It fell upon me, and I began a terrible twisting fall into the endless space of its darkness, and above the shrieking of the wind and the torrent of the water there echoed in my ears that mocking phrase of Neil's, the whirling around without motion. Then I awoke, screaming. 2. The late Inspector Michau's letter to the Trinity House of Navigation, November 24th, 1799. Honourable Sirs, inspection of the shoal light at this place has been delayed by the bad storms which have been raging here since before my arrival earlier this month. Great seas making it impossible to put in any sort of boat. Signal flag communication was ineffectual by reason of limited visibility. As we had been informed, the country people here are very hostile to this new light. They are probably responsible for tampering with reef markers and other navigational aids in this vicinity. Concerning the light, I observed daily through my telescope one of the keepers standing watch on the outside parapet in the worst weather, unaware of the hideous truth about his vigilance. But since I learned that an attack had actually been made on the lighthouse, I supposed that the keepers were determined to prevent another, and were thus constantly on guard. The beacon itself, however, has shone steadily. I am at a loss to understand complaints about its unreliability. The seas calmed last week, and I was able to get out to the shoal light with Brian Mackenzie. What I found there was shocking. The vigilant sentry was Neil's corpse, horribly wasted away. He had been fatally wounded in an armed skirmish with some of the fishermen. O'Malley seemed to be in mortal fear of being blamed for making away with his companion in a fit of madness. He could not abide the corpse, and, rather than cast it into the sea, lashed it where I found it. Perhaps its presence there was intended to deter a second surprise attack, though the weather was enough to do that. O'Malley's privations must have been terrible. He existed on stale bread, and of course water, no more. His overwhelming responsibilities would have finished a lesser man. As it is, he is so subject to the wildest visions, followed by only partial comprehension and logic, obsessed with something he calls the Caer Sidhi, that he cannot be called sane, and perhaps has not been sane for some time. He is surely not long for this world. Until you send new keepers, I myself will tend the shoal light. Your obedient servant, John Michau, Shoal Light, Banff Firth, Scotland. Postscript. I cannot understand the post-rider's failure to deliver your letter last night. He claimed failure under circumstances that suggest too much ale. Even in the dark, he could have found the door, if he had, but walked around the lighthouse and felt the stone with his hand. I trust the new keepers reach here very soon, for I seem to be coming down with some obscure illness which is incomprehensible to me. I am conscious of a curious nausea at night, a touch of vertigo, and the stars blur to my eyes and look wrong. End of Caer Sidhi by George T. Wetzel.